Our webinar today is Workflow in SharePoint 2010, How it Works, What it Entails, and How to Get Started with it, presented by Mike Fitzmaurice. Mike is the Vice President of Product Technology for Nintex and is responsible for product direction, evangelism, technical marketing, and technical business strategy. Until May 2008, he had spent more than 10 years at Microsoft, the majority of that time on the SharePoint team in roles including developer evangelism, competitive strategy, enterprise consulting, user education, product marketing, and technical event planning. Before joining Microsoft, Mike served as Director of Research and Development at Advanced Paradigms, Inc., as well as a 5-year tenure as IT Director of the National Association of Broadcasters. Wow. Mike will present for approximately 30 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. To ask a question, use the Q&A button on your live meeting toolbar or press Alt and Q on your keyboard. So I am now delighted to hand you over to our webinar presenter today, Mike Fitzmaurice from Nintex. Good day, Mike. How are you this afternoon?
I am just fine, thanks. Greetings from Seattle. And let's see. Here we go. Here's what I'd like to do. We've got roughly 30 minutes, and the purpose of this presentation, which is Workflow in SharePoint 2010, how it works, what it entails, how to get started with it, this is all about, well, how can I best put this? I want to make absolutely certain that you understand some common concepts that we will depend on you knowing a handful of things in advance. The European SharePoint Conference will have some workflow content, several sessions in fact. In fact, at the end of this talk, I will tell you exactly which sessions are expected to have some workflow content in them. But almost all of it is going to assume that there's a baseline amount of knowledge that you understand about SharePoint and about how SharePoint uses workflow. So if you want to learn more, attend those workflow sessions. But what I would really like to do before we begin is take a quick poll and ask you which of the following statements best describes your experience with SharePoint workflow. If you wouldn't mind, it would be very, very handy to figure out what your skill level is. In truth, in fact, check of the 5 here you see, moving from the top to the bottom, go to the furthest in the bottom that applies to you. I see it, your responses are all over the map, and that's perfectly fine. Let's go a little bit further. And in just a moment, I don't really see any new responses coming in. Hey, Helen, I'm not sure how to show everybody the final results. I do not have any intention of hiding them.
We haven't disabled the results at the moment.
Oh, okay. I'm seeing a little line at the bottom of the slide that says results are hidden. But if everyone can see them, great. So I'm seeing that 34% of you, roughly 1 out of 3, have never used SharePoint workflow ever. Great. You are perfect for this talk. And if you just use the out-of-the-box workflows, that's another 17%. Another fourth of the audience have created a workflow or two in SharePoint Designer, but none of them were complex. Good. Most of you have self-selected yourself into the right categories. 17% of you have created workflows in Visual Studio, and 4% have created elaborate workflows in SharePoint Designer. You are welcome to stay, but my guess is you know what I'm going to be talking about during this webinar. Perfectly okay, everyone is welcome, but the content that I'm going to cover here is really, well, it's truly fundamental content. And you'll see, this is not about creating workflows. Perhaps given time we can do that, but this is really explaining how SharePoint runs workflows, what the pieces are inside of a workflow, where you can use workflows, and so on and so forth. how to create workflows, how to work with workflows. I have a talk that will cover some of that, including when to use SharePoint Workflow versus other workflows. I know there are sessions on SharePoint Designer, sessions on business processes. You'll get a lot of that at the conference, and we really look forward to seeing you there. But think of this as the prerequisite knowledge, the fundamentals they'll sort of expect you to know. Because if we add this to the beginning of our presentations, well, they'll take 30 minutes extra, and that would be unfortunate. So let's continue. Here's where SharePoint can put a workflow. There are 3 places where you can use workflows inside of SharePoint. You can have a workflow directly connected to a list or a library. So assuming that you've used SharePoint to some extent, SharePoint maintains lists, SharePoint maintains libraries. It is possible for you to say, I need a workflow here being a list or a library. You create a workflow right there, or you say, I want to use a workflow right at that location. And the nice thing about workflows that are bound to a list or a library is that you can certainly run them manually on any item, any document, or any list item, but you can also set them to run automatically when a new workflow, or a new document is created, or a new list item is created, or when something has been modified. Very, very handy. So if you want to have automated workflows kick off, you need to put them inside of a list or a library. There's actually a special case of workflow called a reusable workflow. This is a little bit different. It is not directly tied at the time you create it to one specific list or one specific library. You'll go to a site or a collection of sites, or even all the way to a farm. You will create a workflow that's meant to be used by a list or by a library or whatnot, and essentially create it so that it is offered to be used in other places. Then when you're looking at a list or a library or even a content type, you have available to you a list of all the reusable workflows, and you can just attach them or associate them with your list, your library, your content type. The nice thing about it is many different lists or a combination of lists and libraries and content types can all use the same workflow, hence the term reusable workflow. These can be set up because since you're associating them with a list or a library or a content type, at the time you say, I want this reusable workflow to apply to this list, at that point you can say, this in turn should also be triggered by a change to an item, the creation of an item, or manually. And then finally, and this is a new thing that was introduced in SharePoint 2010, there's the concept of a site workflow. The idea here is, and people familiar with SharePoint 2007 might well understand this, once upon a time, if you wanted to run a workflow inside of SharePoint, especially if it was going to spend all of its time working with several pieces of SharePoint content, or perhaps working with content that lives outside of SharePoint, you nevertheless would have to create a list item or a document just so it could hold a workflow to run. Sort of a stub or a proxy item whose sole function in life was not so much to do anything but give you something out of which to run a workflow. You couldn't just create a workflow inside of SharePoint and then say, I'll run it when I need it. Well, in SharePoint 2010, site workflows were created so that you could just save a workflow to a site and then run it when you wanted, but you didn't have to create a document and then say, attach this workflow to this document and then run it, and keep the document around just so that you have a place to connect the workflow. Site workflows are great in that respect. They aren't tied to content. That's where SharePoint can put a workflow. The way you go ahead and associate a workflow with SharePoint is when you're in a list or a library or a site, you go to Workflow Settings from the ribbon and click Add a Workflow. And here, in fact, is an example of that right here. We're inside of a shared document library. Actually, no, I take that back, a contacts list. And we want to create a workflow to run on contacts. So all I did was go into Workflow Settings. One of my choices is to add a workflow. You click in there, you'll be presented with a list of available workflow templates. That is right here. That's, again, those are workflows that are available for you to use in this location. They're reusable workflows, and in this particular case, you choose the one you want. When you associate a workflow with a container, a list, a library, a content type, you need to give it a name inside of this location. This is known as an association. So we're going to call here, these are workflow templates. The workflow, as the template is associated with this location, that's in it. Give that a name. You pick a list into which you'll put the workflow tasks. You choose a list that'll be used to hold the workflow history, because as the workflow executes, SharePoint will log status update information in there. The task list is there so that as tasks get assigned to users in the course of filling out or completing a workflow, there's a standard place for them to go. Users will usually get emails that tell them you have a task, give them a link to it, so they don't need to realize that they have to go to this list, but you need to provide the location where the tasks are going to be. You also have some options to decide whether or not users can manually run the workflow, and if so, whether they need permissions on the list in order to start the workflow, or whether it should happen automatically, or when a new item is created, or whether it should start automatically when an item is changed. Those are all decisions you get to make. So where do workflows come from? When we were looking at that list of templates back here, those are created somewhere. Some of them are provided out of the box. Some of them are created custom. We'll get to SharePoint Designer workflows in just 1 second. But what I first want to do is make sure you understand the fundamentals of how workflow works inside of SharePoint. Workflows are created based on Windows Workflow Foundation. This is it's a facility inside of .NET, which is a standard way to allow workflow to be added to any service you want. So you could be creating, for example, a custom program of some sort whose job it is to process bank drafts or something to that effect. Or it could be something to handle inventory control on a warehouse. In any of these cases, if you wanted to give your users the ability to create workflows within your product, you could write your own workflow facility, and then everybody's workflow option would be completely different. What Microsoft did was create a standard way to add workflow to an application and then give people the code that they could use to do that. So the SharePoint people, the CRM people, the project server people, and several other groups within Microsoft and several third-party applications use Windows Workflow Foundation so that there's a standard way to put a workflow in their products. So developers don't need to relearn every subtle different way to create workflows, and users don't have to relearn subtle different ways to create workflows. But there are a couple of specific terms that are used in Windows Workflow Foundation that matter a lot here. And if you're curious as to why some workflows work one way with SharePoint Designer and some workflows work a completely different way in code, the next 2 or 3 slides will explain it all. When you create a workflow for Windows Workflow Foundation, The normal expectation is that you're doing it in Visual Studio, and there are two key parts to it. The first part is what's known as the workflow template. The workflow template is this process diagram. In other words, start here, proceed here, make a decision or evaluate some sort of condition, and based on it, go either here or here or here, and then keep moving. Now, these little steps on the way, these are known as activities. So the key point is the template is the map that describes the flow of logic. The steps along the way are known as activities. So a template connects together many, many activities. The template itself is code. It's a .NET assembly, a DLL if you would. It gets registered inside of SharePoint and used accordingly. The individual activities are also code. They are DLLs and so on. They show up as a library of available activities. You'll see them over here inside the workflow toolbox. These are activities, some of which have been dragged and dropped onto the canvas and then used accordingly. So if you understand activities and you understand templates, you're in really good shape. Now let's move on. Building workflows the hard way involves Visual Studio. There is a Windows Workflow Foundation workflow template project. You build this, you compile it so it becomes a DLL, and then you deploy it as part of a package. The package have an extension of WSP. This is actually how you create code solutions for SharePoint for everything. It's the standard solution package. That gets installed, and then it becomes something you can activate on a site collection as a feature. Once you've activated it, it becomes added to that list of available templates, so that anywhere in the site collection you can associate it with a list or a library or a content type or a site. So you create the code, you register it globally when you deploy the WSP package, and then in any different site collection you can activate it as a feature and then use it by associating it with some sort of container inside of SharePoint. You can give users some choice. In fact, if you're authoring a workflow in Visual Studio, you really ought to give some users some choice. Otherwise, you're hard-coding everything. The identity of the people who should approve a document, the amount of time you're supposed to wait to allow them to make some decisions or provide some comments, all of those things. You might want to leave those open, excuse me, and let the owner of the document library or the owner of the site make some decisions at the time they decide to use your workflow in their site or in their list. In other words, when they associate it, give them some choices. So there's the notion of something called an association parameter. This is something that the workflow author, the workflow coder, sets up when they're designing the workflow. And when they register the workflow, when someone associates it with a list or a library or a site, they can make some decisions. So this is a workflow where somebody gets to track the status of something. So there's a choice field. You can decide what the initial choice is. In other words, there are three possible states it could be in. For example, evaluating, deciding, and completed. Those are just three choices. This actually allows the user to decide what the names of those choices are and which one should be the initial state. Also, you get to decide what you want to have happen when a workflow is started. This allows custom messages to be shown, custom task descriptions and so on, custom due dates. You get to decide what they are, what the defaults are at least. This is a way to give users some fine-tuning at the time they start a workflow. Or not, I'm sorry, at the time they say, I want this workflow template to be used in this location. It's good for setting defaults. There is another way to give some users some choice, extra choice, startup parameters. So for example, back here when we're using association parameters, these could be the defaults. The startup parameters could say when I begin an individual workflow, I might make some changes and decide some extra things here. So I could, when I associate a workflow template with a library, indicate that the default reviewer is the owner of the library. But when someone starts a, say, route this document for approval workflow, they could decide that the approver that the task needs to be sent to is a completely different person. But that's better than the coder deciding in advance who the approver is supposed to be. So it's a nice way to give people choices to fine-tune specific things about a workflow rather than putting everything in the hands of the developer. By the way, startup parameters only make sense if the workflow can be manually executed. If it's not manually executed, then the workflow kicks off automatically and there's no opportunity to prompt the user for some startup parameters. There is an easier way to do this, since most of you, other than a handful of you that do Visual Studio work, the ones of you that have dabbled in SharePoint Designer. It's called a declarative workflow. And it's actually not that crazy a concept. What the SharePoint team wound up doing, because they thought it would be too hard to do everything in code, is they created one big piece of code. It's one giant workflow template that has one parameter that's provided when you associate a workflow with a specific list or library or content type. And that one parameter is a big XML document that says what you want to do. In essence, there's not really two different ways of building a workflow. There's really only one way. What the SharePoint people have said is, we've already written the code for a workflow that will potentially do anything you want. Tell us what you want in the form of some XML content. SharePoint Designer's job when it's building a workflow is to create that XML. So when you are in SharePoint Designer and you say, I want to publish a workflow inside of this document library, what you're really doing is taking the master SharePoint Designer or a special template that's been created by the SharePoint team, associating it with that library, and then pumping in a very big block of XML as the one and only association parameter. That's how it all fits together. And most of the time, you don't need to know these details until we start talking about best practices or until we start talking about things to avoid, where we start making assumptions that you know what an association parameter is, or you know what a declarative workflow is, or you know what a startup parameter is. All these things matter a lot, and that's why we're talking about this today, so you can understand how the pieces fit together. I'm going to recap this. A code-based workflow starts out as a workflow template assembly. You're going to create most of the workflow in code. You can provide some parameters for when you associate the workflow with the template with a particular place. And you can also provide some startup parameters so that when someone begins the workflow, they're asked some final questions. But it's code. You deploy it as a package to the global assembly cache. In other words, you're adding code to SharePoint servers. Inside of every site collection, it's activated as a feature that makes it available to sites or lists or libraries, and that's called associating. A declarative workflow is really a special type of code workflow where you provided all the instructions in the form of XML. And then finally, there are a number of products out there that do proprietary workflows. And what they've typically done is modified SharePoint a little bit so that when you want to run a workflow, it calls out to their own product as opposed to just going straight to SharePoint workflows. They typically use event receivers or modifications to the UI in order to redirect the work to their environment. Just wanted to complete the mask. We're not talking about proprietary workflows in this particular talk, but for those of you that wonder about third-party products, some of them, not all of them, work this way. types of projects that you can undertake when working with SharePoint. The easiest one to do that some of you have already tried are out-of-the-box workflows. SharePoint actually gives you a number of out-of-the-box workflows that are ready to use. There's some that are focused around collecting signatures or routing a document for approval or whatnot. They're ready to use. They're there on day one. You can, in fact, customize those out-of-the-box workflows. They are declarative workflows. In 2007, they were hard code. In 2010, they are absolutely positively declarative. They were built in SharePoint Designer, and you can change them if you want to. You can even add custom forms for them using Microsoft Office InfoPath 2010. InfoPath is the forms design environment. If you're creating workflows can use InfoPath forms or ASP.NET forms for startup, for tasks, and such, or even for the association form. And you can design those either with ASP.NET or you can design them with InfoPath. And the out-of-the-box workflows are declarative workflows created in SharePoint Designer using forms created in InfoPath. You can use all of that. You can also open up SharePoint Designer and create custom workflows, declarative workflows. Start from the beginning or start with an existing workflow and edit it. But you can create new actions. There is a very flexible Office task that can be configured in lots of different ways so that you can say you can have a pattern of multiple approvers that happen in one after the other in sequence, or you can have them happen all at the same time in parallel. You can also have several different types of workflows, including having several things happen at once. And in fact, I suspect custom declarative will be the most frequent use of workflow design projects. When you graduate to using code, or if you graduate to using code, it's not necessarily desirable, but that would be this over here. But I'd say more than half of all workflows are custom declarative. It is possible to have a coder assist a non-coder that works in SharePoint Designer. The coder could actually write activities. Those can be written as code. Those can be deployed. And then once they're there, they're available to use. You can put a custom activity inside of a SharePoint Designer or a declarative workflow. It's available to be added. You can also add it in a code project, but it's a way to have the steps in the workflow created in code, but the workflow itself created as XML. Don't worry, you're not directly editing that XML, by the way. You're filling out what looks like an outline. And then finally, do the whole thing in code. There's almost nothing you can't accomplish if you've got Visual Studio in front of you. So depending on what it is you need to make happen, that actually might be a very, very good choice. To get started, I'd recommend starting with the out-of-the-box templates. There's a 3-state workflow for managing the status of tasks. There's a document routing and approval workflow available. And then the next thing I would suggest is experiment with SharePoint Designer. And many, many, many of you have done this. 1/3 of you have not, so try it out. And then finally, attend the conference sessions, and there are several of them, and they ought to help out a lot. If you understand the concepts I've talked about today, several of these talks ought to fit very well. For example, Jan Thielens is going to be running a session called Give SharePoint Designer a Chance. Excellent topic, and will very likely include some workflow content. Keenan Wilson will be doing some coverage of automating business processes with SharePoint composite applications. That will involve SharePoint Designer and InfoPath and, I believe, external lists. Michael Greta is going to be building solutions with SharePoint Designer 2010. I have to believe there will be at least one workflow solution in there. Keenan Wilson will also be back to talk about SharePoint workflow best practices. Now, again, he'll be going through best practices, not starting from the beginning, But yes, if he says your best bet is to put as much as possible in association columns, now you know what an association column is. I have a couple of sessions. One is all about workflow project management and 7 things not to do to make sure your workflow project succeeds. And then I have another one about, well, it's an advanced topic on workflow modeling. But in all of these cases, we're assuming you understand what a workflow is, what a declarative workflow is, what association and startup parameters are, the fact that some workflows are reusable and some are not, the fact that some workflows can be associated with a list or a library, others with content types, and others with sites. All this fundamental knowledge that we covered in the half hour that we've spent, all of that's been very, very important. If you know this, you are fully prepared in order to get something out of these sessions. And now, I'd be absolutely happy to take questions.
Thank you,
and
Mike.
I'll hang around until we're done with all of them. Helen.
Cheers. Thanks, Mike, there for a great presentation on workflow in SharePoint 2010. So as Mike has said, if anybody has any questions for Mike, please enter them now using the Q&A tab on your live meeting toolbar or by pressing Alt and Q on your keyboard. So I have a question here, Mike. The first one is, when should I use SharePoint Designer and when should I use Visual Studio?
Oh, excellent question. Okay. I would say that most of the time, well, it depends on the complexity of the workflow. It also depends on your available skill set. It takes much less time to build a workflow in SharePoint Designer compared to Visual Studio. But SharePoint Designer has some limits. And the big limits that would be okay, how about this? Things SharePoint Designer cannot do, and if you need to do them, you must go to Visual Studio or look to a third-party tool, the easy ones. If you need to loop, in other words, perhaps I want a workflow that does something to every document in a library, or something that keeps checking to see if some work has been done after a long period of time, or you just want to do something over and over again for a while. That would be what's called looping. SharePoint Designer cannot explain to SharePoint that it wants to do that. SharePoint can do it. SharePoint Designer doesn't have the ability to explain how. So you would have to do that in Visual Studio or a third-party tool. Let's see, what are some of, yeah, that's 2 kinds of looping. One would be looping through a collection, and the other one would just be repeating until something changes. If you need that, you need to go to Visual Studio. The other thing is Visual Studio, again, you've got access to all kinds of code from lots of places. You can call web services from other locations. You can access data from databases. You can do Active Directory lookups. You have a lot of capabilities there. However, a lot of those extra capabilities can be created as custom activities, and once that's been done, you can actually still do that inside of SharePoint Designer. In fact, if you go to Codeplex, Microsoft.com, or is it Codeplex.com, there are a number of projects out there for custom activities that can be added to SharePoint and then used by SharePoint Designer to add a lot of these features.
Okay. Another question here, Mike, is does Nintex also use Declarative Workflow?
The answer to that is yes. Again, I'll be talking, well, Nintex will have a booth at the conference. I'll be there a lot of the time. Other colleagues of mine will be there as well, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. And I believe there's an explicit talk about Nintex workflow that I'm doing as a webinar the week before the conference. So I don't mind answering questions because we're in Q&A now, but I don't want this to be about Nintex. This is about SharePoint. But yes, I mean, I want to be nice about that. But yes, Nintex also designs declarative workflows.
Lovely. Another question here is, what steps can I take now to ensure that my workflows will work in the next version of SharePoint and Workflows 4.0?
Okay. Well, how can I best put this? Generally speaking, if you're doing SharePoint Designer workflows, you're in pretty good shape because your workflow is designed as XML. XML is transformable from one format to another. And again, this would require us to know some knowledge about how workflow is going to work in the next version of SharePoint. But I would say the more your workflow is declarative, the more it will be possible using one technique or another to move it from one environment to another. It's harder to transform code compared to data. So the more you rely on code, the more it will be different between Windows Workflow Foundation 3.5, which was what has been used so far in the last couple versions of SharePoint, and we're all assuming that the next version of SharePoint will be based on Windows Workflow Foundation 4.0. If that's true, a whole lot easier to transform data than it is code. So SharePoint, I will probably lend more faith, and again, this is me speculating, I will lend more faith that a SharePoint Designer workflow is easier to migrate. Then again, if the SharePoint guys do the right thing, they'll probably support both to allow legacy workflows to continue to run. At least that's my hope.
Okay. Another question is there any performance loss by using declarative workflows?
Slight. There's a very slight performance loss. It's not radical by any means. Declarative workflows begin as XML, and they need to be evaluated by SharePoint the very first time they're run, but SharePoint will just-in-time compile them so that they're effectively just about as fast as native code once they've been examined once. So there's a slight bit of extra overhead that will make it run not quite as fast, and there's extra error checking and condition evaluating happening behind the scenes. It's possible to take in 2010 a SharePoint Designer workflow and export it to Visual Studio. If you then open it in Visual Studio and look at that auto-generated code, there's a lot more there than you would expect if you'd written it yourself. So because there's an extra step at the beginning to just-in-time compile it, and because the code that's in there after it gets just-in-time compiled is a bit more complex, there's a little bit of a performance loss, but it's really not that big.
Okay. Another question is, can I use workflows with external content types and BCS in brackets?
Yes, actually, it is possible to use a workflow with an external content type or an external list, for example. There's no way to have that happen automatically, but a manual workflow on an external list is something that can be made to work.
Okay. And another question here is, should we avoid creating state machine workflows? Do you think they will be removed in the future?
I would not avoid creating state machine workflows. That's an excellent question, and I actually have a talk about state machine workflows at the European SharePoint Conference. So I love state machine workflows. It's a way of looking at a workflow problem in a very orderly way. So instead of just saying start here, branch all over the place, you say, well, at some point, either somebody is approving a document or revising a document or publishing a document, and you're in one of three states. If you're approving it, you can either approve it, in which case you'll transform to the publishing state, or you'll reject it, in which case it goes back to the author for changes, and so on and so forth. So it allows the workflow to follow the path based on the decisions people make instead of the predetermined path someone has created. If that sounds esoteric or strange, come to my session. I'll explain how it is very, very practical and very real world. I will say that when Windows Workflow Foundation 4.0 was released, they dropped state machine workflows from it, and there was so much clamoring from the community that they wound up adding it back. First of all, as a project template, and then eventually as a native workflow pattern. So state machine workflows are just too useful. I don't think they'll go away at all.
Okay. And the last question here is there a limitation on the number of workflows or workflows objects, meaning running workflows?
There are in theory, I suppose. Actually, no. I can't even running workflows. SharePoint doesn't really work that way. When you look at the way SharePoint actually runs workflows, what it does is either at a timed interval or when you do something to trigger the start of a workflow, SharePoint will then take a look at all the available workflows and check and see which workflows have a task that's waiting to be executed. It will then batch up all those workflow tasks into a bundle, and it'll execute all of them. And then it will stop. And then it will wait for something else, either a timed interval or a user doing something, and then create another batch and run those tasks. So SharePoint looks at all the pending workflows and then the tasks that are waiting to be performed, and it treats them in batches. It's not really about how many workflows are running at the same time, because if you have a workflow that's running at the moment and it's waiting for a user to do something, your workflow is asleep, and SharePoint doesn't need to do anything with it. So it's really about how many tasks can be executed at the same time, and if you have more memory, if you configure SharePoint a little bit differently, or if you've got more web front ends, then more tasks can be worked on at the same time.
Okay.
It's about that behind the scenes, it's all about how many tasks can be processed at the same time, not how many workflows are running at the same time.
Great. Okay. Well, that brings to an end our Q&A session for today.